One question I get asked all the time is, should I plant seeds or transplants? And in today's video, I'm going to teach you how you can answer that question for yourself. There are a few crops that almost always need to be directly sown by seed right into the garden. Normally that's because those crops have a fragile root system. Many of those crops are root crops, the crops that we eat the root that grows below the ground. Beets, carrots, parsnips, radishes, and turnips. The roots of these crops do best when left to grow undisturbed. So that's one easy thing to remember. If it's a root crop, start it from seed in the garden. There are also a few other crops that do best if you can directly sow them in the garden. Some of the crops that don't like to have their roots disturbed are cucumbers, melons like watermelon and cantaloupe, summer squash, winter squash, and also beans and peas. Sometimes that means waiting for the optimal growing temperature to start those seeds, but ultimately those seeds will be more successful if you can start them directly in the garden. So that's the two categories of crops. There's the root crops, and then the other crops that have bigger seeds that don't like their roots disturbed. Now let's talk about some of the crops that are almost always started from transplant. And those are typically long season plants that take a long time to germinate and grow and develop in your garden. Those longer season crops would be things like tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers that definitely do better if you can give them a head start indoors and then transplant them into the garden. There's usually not enough time in the growing season to get those all the way from seed to harvest. A few other long growing season vegetables that do best started from transplant are artichokes, asparagus, Brussels sprouts, and tomatillos. Those also tend to do better if you can give them a head start by using a transplant. In my experience, there's also a few seeds that are very slow to germinate and are kind of tricky to get germinated, and I've had better luck starting those seeds indoors and then growing them from transplant. And those would be cucamelons, ground cherries, and celery. All right, so now we've covered which ones really like to be started in the garden, which ones like to be started by transplant, and now we're getting to kind of the more confusing ones that don't mind being started either way. So I'm going to give you a list of vegetables that don't mind being started either way, and then I'm going to give you a couple principles to keep in mind about which one you should use. So some of the vegetables that don't mind being started from seed or transplant are bok choy, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, collard greens, kale, leeks, lettuce, Malabar spinach, mustard greens, okra, roselle hibiscus, and Swiss chard. Spinach and kohlrabi are also such fast-growing vegetables that they do best started from seed, but you can use transplants. When you're thinking about which one to use in the garden, one thing to remember is the temperature, the soil temperature and the outside temperature. For example, when we're thinking about fall gardening in Arizona, the outside temperatures are still pretty hot at times when we begin planting. And so you can start a lot of those vegetables from seed earlier than you could start the transplants. Those seeds are going to be planted a little bit deeper, and they're going to grow and become accustomed to those warmer temperatures, and then hopefully by the time they're sprouting and growing, temperatures will have dropped down and then they can grow. If you wait a little bit longer to plant until temperatures have cooled off just a bit, then you're safe to plant transplants or seeds in the garden. If it's still really warm outside, it's better to use seeds than transplants because a lot of times those transplants will just burn up. So for some of those crops, keep that in mind, and it's more about timing and preference. Either way, just depending on what time of year it is or how much time there is left in the growing season. If you're just trying to get a quick crop in, you may want to use a transplant. There are a few crops that don't fall into either category, things like potatoes and garlic. Obviously, you're not going to start those from seed or transplant. Potatoes are started from sprouted potatoes. Easy enough, right? Garlic is planted from, believe it or not, garlic. So you're not going to use seeds or transplants for either of those. Onions, on the other hand, you can buy onion sets, onion seeds, or onion plants. And in my experience, onion sets, the little round balls, they bolt almost without fail. They're already stressed out, and those tend to bolt and not do well. You can use onion seeds. Those take a little bit longer, and you have to make sure they germinate and then thin them and get them planted correctly. The easiest way and the most successful way to grow onions are from onion plants. The little onion plants that you can buy already sprouted that look kind of like a miniature scallion or green onion. So those are kind of the odd categories that aren't planted from seed or transplant in the garden. There's definitely a time for seeds and transplants in the garden. Some advantages from seed are you are more in control. If you look at a seed catalog, there's so many different options, so many varieties, and you can also time your plantings to be ready at the optimal time to plant. Another advantage to growing from seed is it's much less expensive. A package of seeds can last several seasons and give you several dozen plants. On the other hand, planting from transplants is simple. The chances for success when you plant from transplant are typically a lot higher, especially if you plant the right crop in the right place at the right time. Transplants are definitely convenient, they're easy to plant, and they give you more predictable results. One disadvantage for transplants is they're often much more expensive than starting from seed. Transplants also often give you a harvest sooner. Another advantage is that when you're putting out a transplant, it's a little bit further along and it's going to be more resistant to damage from pests and birds and things like that may damage smaller things like seeds. Hopefully, after watching today's video, you're a little bit more confident about knowing whether you should use seeds or transplants in your garden. Thank you so much for watching.